No Time to Die or like No Time for the Present or something to do with that. I don't know. That was just kind of like what I came up with. So we're back. It's the Talkin TV podcast, but here to give you something a little bit different this time. So, Chris, what is the name of our podcast?
The name of our podcast, is Talkin TV.
That is, TV being the key word here, because it's funny because for all the episodes that we've done like a decent amount of episodes too. This is what, like, if we're talking overall, this is like what, our 13th episode? That's pretty awesome. I don't know about you, but I'm pretty happy, and I'm just overall proud of like where we've come in terms of like from where we started, the amount of years that we talked about doing our own podcast, trying to get it off the ground about 2 years ago. Then, we both kind of went our separate ways, and now we're back here, kind of like right back all where it started.
Yeah, there's a lot that goes into this that we don't need to bog you down with or bore you with, but there was very much so a huge learning curve to doing this, and there's still, I think, if we're going to be honest and open, which is something I think was the mission of the show, so I'm just going to say it right now because it doesn't embarrass me. I think there still are things that we need to iron out, but yeah, we're doing it.
Yeah,
like,
the point being is that
it.
At the end of the day, it comes down to, like, we could talk about all the different ancillary factors that go into everything, like, but at the end of the day, it comes down to, just Shia said it best, just do it, and we're doing it. And so it's funny that we brought up that theme of, but again, we're finally back to talking about a TV show, and also the idea of kind of ending up back where you started, which overall, ultimately, I feel like was the theme of this TV show that we're about to talk about, which, Chris, what are we talking about for this episode?
Today we're talking about actually a television show.
Yes.
So, the third one on a show called Talkin TV. But like we say, it's a show about TV, film, and cinema. It just, the name rhymes.
Any form of
it works.
Any form of imagery recorded using a camera, but its presentation method should not matter at this point, I feel like, especially considering how far TV has surpassed film in terms of where back in the day the whole thing was that TV shows were disposable, but people ended up bonding with them because they were able to form more of more of a bond because of how more personable they felt.
Relationships.
Relationships felt. Where to now we're in a situation where films feel more disposable than TV, to the point where we literally consider more things that we watch at home on our TV screen cinematic than we do out in a theater.
Right, and if you want to hear us elaborate more on the concept of disposable filmmaking, check our last episode, Black Christmas. Anyways, speaking of relationships, today we're talking about a show that I formed a very fond relationship with.
Same.
I've actually watched it twice, all the way through. It's very near and dear to my heart, regardless of the things that I do see and recognize with it that are flawed and that did hurt it. And that show is Silicon Valley.
Silicon Valley. Created by Mike Judge and Alec Berg, who went on with Bill Hader to create HBO's, I would say, newest hit comedy, Barry. But yeah, Silicon Valley, the show about a fictional startup tech company that started out of a, what did Ehrlich call it in the first season? A think tank? I forgot what he called his house, but out of just like a regular house in the suburbs of California that eventually grew, albeit many missteps and many, I would say, a little bit of a reliance on certain character types, but at the same time, that reliance never ended up taking away from them being people, first and foremost. It was a very thin line that it walked, but it always managed to bring it back and make these guys feel very anchored in reality, which is something that I think is probably the show's best strength, because I think that's ultimately what saved it in its last couple seasons after a certain person left the show, in terms of just overall, the thing that kept it anchored for me as what I call the dark times were the fact that these guys were such well-developed characters, even if they were like relying a little bit too much on certain shticks, but to the point of almost where the show became a little bit self-aware, which is what these comedies kind of have to do. It's what I've seen a lot of, is where you get these comedies that kind of rely on the same character shticks over and over and over again, sometimes for years on end. And then to the point where it's like the only way that they can add something new is if they become a little bit self-aware about it, which sometimes that works, sometimes it doesn't. And I think that in this case it did. But that's just one small facet about what made this show, at least for me, my favorite comedy that HBO has ever done.
Yeah, so I think I agree with a lot of what you just said. I think that this show, like the AI that they built in this show, became a little too aware, and ultimately led to its downfall. See what I did there?
Hey.
Now, I do have to say that if you didn't think we were going to jump right into spoilers, you were wrong. Here we go.
I feel like that's pretty much established at this point. It's
Right.
like, we get it. This is not your typical internet show. We're not going to do okay, this is the spoiler-free section, and now we're going to jump full on into spoilers. No, we talk about the stuff as we would talk about anything. If you don't want to get spoiled, I'm sorry. That's just, this is not the show you were looking for.
Right, and in the spirit of jumping right in, the character who leaves, who really is a huge hit to the show,
Really is. Like, looking back, like, it's honestly kind of amazing how, like, a majority of, like, the show's, like, not just overall humor, but, like, gut busting, like, almost weirdly in and of itself. Like, a big part of the show's identity was TJ Miller's Erlich Bachman, who famously left after season 4 due to, I don't remember exactly what the scenario was. I think it had something to do with a falling out of, I don't remember if it was a situation of where, like, he just wanted to get out in order to do other things, or he saw the scripts for season 4 and he just didn't like it and wanted to jump ship. I don't remember what the specifics were. They're kind of never really easy. It's never usually one thing in terms of these big production fallouts between, like, actors and creators. So I don't know, but
yeah, no, I mean, regardless of what the reason is, we're not really here to talk about the behind the scenes. What we are here to talk about is, like, the show itself. And I think that the first 3 seasons, and I'm a big TV guy, I really push for the balance in the beginning of our production meetings and stuff for this show. Like, I love television, and I'm growing to love movies, and I think now I've struck a balance where I love both equally. But I do have to say that I sort of went to film school to eventually one day create television, not to be a filmmaker in the traditional sense of, like, shooting a film and putting it in theaters. So to me, I look through television with even more of a microscope, as I've seen a lot more of it. My filmography is more derived of television. So I thought, and especially me, I'm a sitcom junkie. I love this stuff. I give at least any sitcom that has a slight buzz a chance, because if people are loving it and liking it, I want to be a part of that. And the fun thing is being a part of a show as it's going on. Silicon Valley was something I was lucky enough to jump into in the 5th and 6th season. And watching those first 3 seasons, I have to say that, the first 3 seasons of the show, there is an energy and there is a life to it that clearly disappears. And while the show does make a really good effort, because here we are talking about it in the finale, we're covering the finale, but we have to talk about it as a whole, it never, to me, sort of comes back to that feeling, that warmth that you get from the first 3 seasons, where I literally laugh out loud multiple times every episode. That does not happen often. I'm telling you, The Office is one of my favorite shows of all time, and it's very hard to find shows that compete with The Office. And Silicon Valley, I think if it would have stayed on that path, might not have ended and might not land on the list of top shows. Where it does, it would have been a little higher, is what I'm trying to say.
It's definitely a situation where the one cast member leaving, I would say, it's one of the few times, really, where I can't even say this about a lot of other shows. Like, we've seen a lot of shows where cast members come and go. Most of the time it's because of a character death, because of a story arc. Sometimes it's behind the scenes. Usually with comedies, it's a lot more because of behind the scenes shenanigans, because the characters on sitcoms and comedy shows tend to stay a lot longer than dramas. They tend to be more character focused than story focused, as I would say. But it definitely is a situation where there was something that was lost from the show when Miller left. But to your credit, and to the show's credit, I think it did a very good job of regaining its footing, in terms of, like, for me, as bad as certain other points were for the show after Miller left, it was definitely a situation where, for me, 4 was definitely the lowest bar that the show ever hit. Where that was the moment where it's like the over-reliance on kind of like the act of God that kind of would always save them in the finale kind of really reared its head ugly. But to me, it felt like it was only a climbing and a learning curve. Like Judge and Berg were able to pivot from Miller's departure, and because they had an entire season to work with it, as opposed to kind of like an abrupt in the middle, he leaves, say he left like after season 4 and ended, and like, oh shit, what do we have to do? And then season 5 ends up getting pushed back production like a year, and it's very clear when it comes back that it's like, wow, we have no idea what the fuck we're doing. I will say that as rocky as season 5 start was, at the very least, by the time it ended, it felt like we were on a trajectory of where we're going, to the point where when season 6 came out, despite the fact that it felt like something that was totally different from where the show had started, it felt like, in a way, both a natural progression for where these characters would end up from where they started, and also kind of breathing a little bit of new life into a show that was on a downward spiral for a long time. And I have to give it a credit for that, because that's not something that a lot of shows can pull off. And I have to give it to these creators and these actors and these writers to just overall maintaining the consistency of their show and like caring about their audience and caring about their product as much. I really do have to give a lot of credit to them.
Right, no, so I think that this show sort of reminds me of a professional sports team, whereas you have a few good seasons and, you know, then maybe some injuries happen and there's like a coaching change, and so you dip down for a bit, but you're an organization competing on the professional level, right? Like, you are in it to win it, or else why would you be there? So I think inevitably they do end on a high, not as much of a high as they start the show, and I think here's the reason why. So we talk about TJ Miller, Erlich Bachman leaving the show, and how season 4, to me, rewatching this in preparation for our episode over the past few weeks, smooth sailing until I hit season 4, and it suddenly felt like homework. And the reason is because I think what a lot of sitcoms try to do, but fail to do, is the ensemble cast. If you look at Friends, if you look at How I Met Your Mother, if you look at The Office...
I say Community as well.
No, I don't, and here's why. Because you don't care about, you don't care about Phoebe the way you care about, Ross and Rachel. You just care about them more. There's more, you get more from them. You don't care about Creed or Kevin as much as you care about Michael Scott. You still love these characters, but you do not care about Marshall as much as you care about Ted. They are ensemble casts, but they fail to make every member of the ensemble cast equal, whereas Community in Silicon Valley does. So when you lose any character, regardless of their, involvement in the company in this situation, Eric was just an investor, but when you lose that chemistry in a show that truly pulls off the ensemble cast, then you are in complete chaos. And so that's why I also do tip my hat to them for wrapping this up in such a way that was graceful, because it clearly could have crashed and burned if you look at season 4.
Did very quickly. And it's actually funny to bounce off your point, because you're right. So in terms of like most sitcoms, despite the fact that they are pitched as ensemble casts, it's very clear that they have the focus character. You're right. Ted for How I Met Your Mother, Michael for The Office, Leslie for Parks and Rec, Jerry for Seinfeld.
The list goes on.
The list goes on and on and on. And it's weirdly enough, because Friends is actually the one case where I would disagree with you, where to me, Friends falls more so into the camp of like a Community and Silicon Valley, where yes, they have their focus characters, but to me, Friends is the one kind of oddball, because to me, Friends is the one show where there is no focus character. Like, you have, the Ross and Rachel are like the linchpin in terms of like why you watch it, but Friends to me still is one of the only shows in existence, and this is saying something, because there really aren't that many other shows. Like, the only other show that I would think that really comes close to this is Game of Thrones, because Game of Thrones kills its central focus character after at the end of the first season, and the rest of that show you're following, it really is based in the ensemble, and there really is, not until the last 2 seasons with where the focus really becomes based around Jon and Daenerys, it really is based in that ensemble, where Friends, I can't think of a single character that really is like the focus point, and I think a lot of that has to do with its intro, because that what that show did differently than a lot of other shows is, even Silicon Valley didn't do this, because Silicon Valley started with Richard, and even though it had a great ensemble cast, it was still Richard's show. Richard is the main character. Friends is the only show out of that entire list of sitcoms where I'd say there is no main central character. Like, the trajectory and focus of that show is based in the ensemble, where you have Ross and Rachel, but to me, Phoebe and her antics, and Joey and her antics, and even to the point where when Monica and Chandler got together, that to me was way more interesting than anything that was going on with Ross and Rachel, where their back and forth kind of like was almost like it was the backbone of the show, but at the same time it also became like that gag that's like, oh my god, get to the point already. And it's like, it really is, again, kind of really diverging off our original point, where Friends is the only show that I would say kind of broke away from that typical sitcom formula of having the main central character and then have everyone else supporting them. It's the only one to me that I've seen. But bringing it back to Silicon Valley, Silicon Valley was that situation, I would say, much more so like a How I Met Your Mother, or like an Entourage, where, you had your central focus character, but you also had that scene-stealing supporting character that was very clearly the interest. Like, Ted's your main character for How I Met Your Mother, but you're watching that show for Barney. And for me with Entourage, Eric and and Vince are your main characters, but you're watching that show for Ari and Drama and Turtle and all the stupid shit that they do, you know? Whereas this show, Richard's your main character, and he's a very funny character, and I think that for the type of character that they set him up with, kind of like this Jesse Eisenberg, Michael Cera-esque character, that like you're only watching this guy to see him goof up and how awkward and nervous and how pathetic he really is compared to everyone else. The type of growth that they have that character go through throughout the entirety of the show, even in the moments where he is with Ehrlich, who is very clearly the scene stealer and very clearly the guy that you watch the show for. I think it is very commendable what the show does there, and not just with him, how they kind of like grow the other characters around them, you know, where a major subplot of every single season is the back and forth between Dinesh and Guilfoyle, and how that show ended up making Kumail Nanjiani like one of the biggest comedy superstars. And in a way, after Ehrlich left, I would say the show actually did a very, very good job of kind of bringing up Jared as kind of the new scene stealer, where Zach Woods, it's hysterical to me how they've always like kind of like done like made that character a very intentionally underwritten character with like those random pop-ups like where you find out about his past and make you kind of turn it from like another typical awkward character to like this really weirdo character that you don't necessarily know fits into any sort of societal norm or bracket, and you kind of love him for that, while at the same time you also wonder at certain points like, is this guy a sociopath? But you're right, it's like all those different little facets and interesting character tidbits that it's so interesting how they focus it, because they rely so much on the tropes, but at the same time, without those tropes, like these characters wouldn't be the characters that we know and love that makes the identity of this show.
Right, and so speaking about how interwoven they are, I think that is why I put Friends in the category that I do, is that you don't have the same depth of presence out of the gates that you do with this cast that you're given in Silicon Valley. They're just not as figured out yet, you know, and maybe that's where we disagree, but to me, that's why I think that this show had something so special going for it out the gates. Now, it was a little sad to see it eventually become pretty easy to figure out. Richard's going to get so close to having it all, and then he's going to lose it. And then he's going to get so close to having it all, he's going to take one step he's going to take 2 steps forward, 1 step back.
And then the reasoning for how they get there, it's like, oh, Gavin comes in and does something else shitty, or some other CEO
And so you can watch the show to get into that. I'm usually off put by that. But again, the reason why I stuck around, because you guys know me at this point. I've said many times I don't like procedurals. I don't like, you know, living inside of a very tight-knit formula. But this show is one of the few shows that I think is still going to land in one of my favorite shows of all time because of how good the characters were. But I think, if I'm being honest about it, the first 3 seasons really do the heavy lifting for me, because I still do think that, like, well, season 4 was just... It's hard to watch, and I think anyone out there understands that. It's
awful because it's a slow downward spiral that for me like doesn't culminate, and it's almost a situation of where like the kind of act of God that we get at the end of every single season, you know, the TechCrunch thing at the end of season 1, the Falcon.
Right, but before I forget my point, what I'm trying to say is that they recover in season 5 and 6, but it's sort of like, it felt like to me rather that, well, we can't not finish this show, but we're going to take time and push season 5 back because we're writing Barry, and we're going to do this because Richard's in Verizon commercials and he's in Godzilla now. It just felt like that was a hit they could not recover from. Season 6 was great, though, in my opinion. Like, they worked with what they had.
Really enjoyed it.
They worked with what they had. They actually introduced one of my favorite actors, who I'm always rooting for, who is I hope he gets there one day. That's George Basil, who was the Richard's old boss, and I think he was underutilized. I really liked his character. Yeah, I'm always rooting for him when I see him.
What else has he been in?
He's been in Flaked. He's been in Wrecked. A few cult shows that I really love, and that's just like, listen, guys, I know I enjoy some pretty bad television. Now, Flaked is a phenomenal show. Wrecked is not. But I also enjoy, like, bad television because I like to laugh at it, like Black Christmas. You know, bad movie. And so, like, him, I just want him to... the world should be his. You know, he seems like a good dude. I listened to a podcast with him. And so, like, what I'm trying to say is that I honestly think that the last 3 seasons of the show were really nothing special, but I like I did with one of my favorite cameos, guest appearances, guest actors, I'm trying to find something good in it, because those first 3 seasons to me are almost legendary. And I don't know if that is that's me being human, right? because I'm trying to be a film critic, but I also like have such an emotional attachment to those first 3 seasons that I don't want to say the last 3 seasons were really not that good, even though like they recovered, but like does that matter?
It's a situation of where
should a good show have to recover?
Yes. Well, that's the thing is we have talked about it. Like I've talked about this a couple different points about a couple different shows when I've talked about it, is how different shows go through different eras kind of reception and overall points, where no show I would say is almost universally beloved for almost the entirety of its run. We talk about like polarizing finales all the time about how so many shows never seem to be able to stick the landing. But I think that almost most of the time, to me at least, it never is a situation of where like, okay, it was just the finale that was bad. Like there was never a situation of where like it was getting to a point where it's like the writers were clearly building up that they had no idea what was going on. And we were just so enraptured by the show because we were so invested in it at that point that we just never saw what was coming. Silicon Valley was one of these situations where we were kind of already immersed in this decade of internet fanboying and kind of following along, and it was one of those shows that I talked about this when I wrote my quick little spiel on Facebook after I watched the finale, where it was a show that kind of clung on how HBO always made their comedies work, is that they always put them right after whatever the big drama was on. I know that was how Entourage and Deadwood were able to succeed for a while, was because they were still going off the back of The Sopranos, and it's why The Wire kind of like had such a problem hanging on and keeping its core audience throughout the majority of its run, even though now you look back, The Wire is regarded as one of, if not the most influential shows of all time.
It's a crowning achievement now.
But Silicon Valley, I said, it came on, I hit at the sweet spot. It came on when HBO's big drama at the time, their land point drama, Thrones, was in its 4th season, was when Silicon Valley debuted. It took me personally a little bit to get into it because I didn't start watching it consistently live, like every week, every Sunday. Man, I'm looking forward to it until season 3. Seasons 1 and 2, I kind of watched through. It wasn't exactly a show that spoke to me because I was still like kind of adjusting my tastes, fine-tuning my tastes, if you will. Hopefully it's not a little bit too pretentious.
No, the show is a maturity.
Comedy's always been a genre to me that has been a little bit confusing because growing up, like I said, I was a kid that missed, I feel like, a lot, or was too young to appreciate a lot of like the good comedy. Like I said, Seinfeld ended literally the year that I was born. So like if that just doesn't like put anything in perspective. So like my whole thing growing up was like watching a lot of Disney Channel, all those terrible shows, live action Disney, Nickelodeon, Sweet Life of Zack and Cody, Victorious,
easily digestible comedy.
iCarly, very easily digestible, very on the nose content. So when it came to getting a little bit more complex, I found it a lot easier to get into dramas because dramas to me were always more emblematic of real life. And this was kind of the first show. I would say it was this and Entourage, because I was getting into Entourage around the same time, because this was sophomore, junior year of high school when I was finally getting into this, but I don't think I started watching it consistently until I was like senior year of high school, getting into college. Entourage was a show that I started watching end of high school. I remember I was bonding with my uncle over that because that was like his favorite show to watch back in the day. And I love Entourage for a lot of different reasons, but I feel like those are the two shows that really kind of started to open my eyes and be like, okay, comedy can be more than just goofy gags and one-note characters and dumb catchphrases and all this shit. And so when I watch a show like this, and I talk about phases of the show that it had, yeah, it was a situation where it definitely changed. Maybe not so much for the better of how we would have wanted. And yeah, it was never going to have the same kind of magic that the first 3 seasons did. But in terms of like regaining its footing and introducing something new, both to the world of comedy television and the world of storytelling and the overall world of where this show was going for these characters, I just think there's something new to appreciate. It's what I talk about with this last season of Thrones, where, yeah, I agree, that finale sucks. It's one of the worst finales I've ever seen. But that still is not going to take away from the stuff that I enjoyed overall in that last season. And there was a lot of interesting things in that last season that I could take away, and I feel like that can also be applied to these last 3 seasons of Silicon Valley, that argument as well.
Right, and let me just say that that's a great way to put it, because by no means do I hate the last 3 seasons of this show. I mean, maybe season 4 was it felt like homework, but it was fun homework. It's like doing homework for your favorite class. You still have to do it, but it's like, okay, this could be worse. And so with that being said, I think, like, this is still one of my favorite shows probably of the decade, and that is because even through all of its struggles, even through all that it had to overcome, they fought through adversity, these creators, these actors, This show dealt with a lot. It almost looked like it wasn't going to return at one point, and then it comes back, and everyone's like, people were sort of rooting for it or against it. It very much so cut the line down the middle, and I think one thing that is impressive is its ability to end on such a high note that it did, and like you said, tipping your hat to the writers and cast members. Out of the gates, this is already a polarizing show because it's going to be hard to get your baby boomers to watch the show because there's a lot they won't understand. These writers are very well read, you know, they're sort of like making jokes about trends that we haven't even realized yet, and then the episode comes out and you know it was written months before, but that trend just hit. And so like this as someone who tries to get more out of film than just a quick, you know, half hour before dinner or just, you know, I try to really digest it and take something away from it. This is a very well written show because it has to be at this point. There's so much thought into it. You have to be well read and researched to write a show like this. And so that's why I could never sit there, and I don't want to make it seem like I bashed this show, and this is what I'm getting at. I don't want to bash this show in the first half of this episode because it's obviously impressive. I just felt that it just came out swinging so hard, and it never got back to that form, unfortunately.
Definitely one of the situations where, like you said, just so many people watch these types of content, these types of shows. The whole reason why television is what it is, just because, again, they want to zone out. They don't want to think. They just want something quickly to be entertained by after dinner so they can just go to bed, you know, that they can fall asleep to. And this is something that definitely had that and was definitely, I would say, was very aware of that and was able to incorporate a lot of, I would say, traditional sitcom techniques, while at the same time, obviously adapting them for the modern day audience and what it was, what's it called, for when it was released. But I liked the point that you brought up in terms of like seemingly talking about trends that seem like they're so in the moment, but it's prepped like months before. Like it really is a credit to these guys. And obviously, like I said, this is Mike Judge we're talking about. This is the guy who did Beavis and Butthead, years of that. This is the guy who gave us Idiocracy, which is a schlocky mid-2000s comedy that today is regarded as more relevant and more forward-thinking and ahead of its time than any other comedy that came out. So these guys clearly do know what they're doing in terms of forward-thinking, in terms of like understanding what the trends of the time are going to be. Mm-hmm. And that for me was a very interesting sticking point in terms of what made me keep wanting to come back to the show. Is I was always thinking, and there was always this fear in the back of my head. I'm like, okay, when are they going to fall into what are the wacky adventures going to be this week? And it never felt that way, even in situations where it did blatantly feel like. I remember this one season 2 episode where Richard is trying to get Adderall from this one neighborhood kid.
One of my favorite moments.
Oh, it's so great. For me, it's one of like the defining moments. And he goes, and it's the funniest thing to me is it's Griffin Gluck, who was the kid from one of the two kids in American Vandal, and seeing little Griffin Gluck fucking like punch the shit out of Richard. And then he goes to Ehrlich to tell him about it, and Ehrlich goes and rails on this kid and like fucking slaps the shit out of him, throws his bike over a hedge. Again, just imagine that TJ Miller brought to the show and just be like, you bring me the 5 Adderall, I'm gonna go in, I'm gonna fucking slit your parents' throats or some shit, like some crazy.
Yeah, he says, don't tell your fucking
like
parents
that.
or I'll slit their throats while they're sleeping.
And that's so
the thing.
Good.
That's the thing. Ehrlich brought a lot to the show, and losing him was a big hit. Now, I do have to say this. You could watch this show on 2 layers, and you actually made me think about this when you said your whole thing about, like, you know, like, the modern era of television is trying to be more than just what you put on to fall asleep, you know, and that half hour after you've looked over, you know, your work at home and you've set everything to go for the next morning, because that's how most people live their lives. And so television now is trying to be more than that. And so what I think that Silicon Valley did a great job of was it had that layer of your generic typical sitcom where the characters are getting into hijinks and there's pitfalls and there's rises and there's all the emotional qualities that you've seen in the shows to come. But the second layer is the tech and the thought and the elegance of predicting the modern events and the pop culture infusion that I don't think many shows do. And I don't know if that's because they don't have writers as smart as the writers of this show, or if it's because this 2010s decade for television, which we will talk about in our best of, really took television and flipped it on its side and propelled it forward.
To the next level in terms of like making this is the decade that made television more cinematic than movies. I think that's a conclusion that we've come to, not just in the last couple of episodes, but over the last couple of years in general now. I feel like since 2016 was really the first year that I really started to notice, because we got things like Stranger Things, like Atlanta, like that was when the Marvel shows really started to take off, because we had
those were hits.
Daredevil,
those were hits.
but that was when they really started to take off. and all the crazy different stuff that we got. Like, that was when we got, again, in terms of like returning shows at the time, like I still remember like Battle of the Bastards and what an event that was. And,
Oh, yeah.
oh my God, like the list goes on. That was when we got the first Netflix season of Black Mirror, you know, with San Junipero, and my favorite episode still of that, quite possibly that entire year, with Nosedive and everything, in terms of like really taking it was asking all the questions that it was the first year where I started to notice that television was finally asking the questions and taking the risks that films just weren't.
Right. And so let me ask you this, because I agree with all of that. Do you know what year did Silicon Valley debut in?
It was 2014. It was spring of 2014, because that was when, like I said, it started off going off the back of Game of Thrones' 4th season, because that was when Game of Thrones' 4th season debuted.
Okay, and so aside from Game of Thrones, it pretty much predates all of these very important shows you just referenced.
For the most part, at least from these last couple of years. Yeah, like obviously, like I said, you look at the first half of the 2010s versus this half of the 2010s. I would say even those two, in general, are almost like polar opposites in terms of like where you get the first half of the 2010s that are still kind of banking off of a lot of the shows that got started that helped really define the 2000s. But for me, at least, I would qualify much more so as defining in the 2010s. Like, yeah, you had stuff like Mad Men and Breaking Bad, like that debuted in the back half, but for me, those are much more so.
Yeah, I'm talking about shows that just started in the 2010s that didn't have their first seasons in like a 2008 or 9 because I think that those shows, along with shows
they're
like
still
Lost,
too influenced by the previous era. And you can't really count Lost in The Office, because Lost is 04, The Office is 05. That's still very much immersed in the previous
and how many
decade.
other. And so I think like we needed those shows to push the envelope a little bit, test the waters, and then you have shows like Silicon Valley that really come in and establish like the new. I hate that Star Wars is in everything I say. The new order of television and filmmaking.
Okay, man, you love Star Wars.
I loved Star Wars.
Yeah. Don't let Disney's bastardization
Past
of it
tense,
affect
loved.
your favorite product.
I love the George Lucas pure Star Wars, and I gotta say, like, I mean, I don't know. I was ready to go to an conclusion unless you have something
I was
else
going to ask you. So you asked, so in terms of like the go-to in terms of like saying like what revolutionized television in general, and kind of like in terms of really introducing the idea of how you can do these kind of much more so dramatic, thought-provoking, and different kind of stories on television, a format that has been primarily for the most part very digestible, very easy to understand, not very deep thinking content. I would say we can both agree is The Sopranos, because that's kind of like the go-to, where it's kind of undeniable the change that the Sopranos made for the world of television. But if I had to ask you, because the problem is that as influential as it was, The Sopranos is still only for drama, and we could point at all these different dramas that came out that helped change the landscape, but will both influence and erupted as a result of The Sopranos, The Wire, Lost, Breaking Bad, Mad Men, Game of Thrones, all these different shows. But my question for you is, what was the defining sitcom that helped kind of revolutionize the sitcom era in terms of like how we can also include this type of thought-provoking material into our comedies as well as our dramas, because we've had dramas for almost as long as we've had comedies, but obviously the difference being that the dramas were always the ones that kind of asked a little bit deeper question. If we go back to, kind of the 60s when television was, the 50s and 60s when television was really starting to go back, we can talk about, even something as cheesy and stupid as the Incredible Hulk TV show, where, on the surface level, it's a cheesy, dumb thing about a Marvel superhero show that obviously is very much a product of its time and very low budget. But also, on the other hand, you can read a little bit into the context of where you're watching a man grapple with the isolation of the fact that he has to intentionally isolate himself for fear of this werewolf-esque struggle that he goes through, where he can't be around people or else he could turn into this thing that could seriously injure and cause harm to them. And he does that out of, kind of his own, he does that out of his own sense of goodwill, but in the same sense, that's also kind of torturing to him. And that's a show that came out in the 60s. So my question is, what would you say was the revolutionary sitcom show where you finally get something that is both easily digestible and funny and entertaining, but also asks potentially some deeper questions as well, just about like regular everyday life?
Yeah, so I guess your question sort of puts the cherry on top of everything I'm trying to say, being that show to me was Silicon Valley. It took the traditional sitcom formula, and for all of its flaws and its struggles, I think it really made you say, I'm laughing, but I'm thinking. What a weird feeling, but I like this feeling, and I want more of this feeling, And to me, like, Silicon Valley, if you're putting me on the spot, and what I've been trying to say about it, to me, it's one of those shows. It's not the only one. Unfortunately, no others come to mind. I'm pretty tired right now, and it's kind of late.
Think about it, right? The shows, I would say, that have always had the most marked effect in terms of what do people remember the most, I feel like have always been designed because they reflect the time that they came out in, right? That's the thing that we can always say, is that we always talk about movies as being timeless, but also we've talked about things that are also very much a product of their time. And that's not a bad thing, because the whole thing is that most media that we enjoy, in terms of the best ones, are often a reflection of whatever the people at the time were thinking, in terms of like providing more context.
Right, but those age well, and I think Silicon Valley will age well.
Right. But and that's just like a specific example. But I'm also talking like in terms of like, so the 80s, it was primarily two. Just if we're talking about sitcoms, it was MASH and Cheers, right? And then as you get more so into the 90s, you kind of have like this influx of different types of shows, like Fresh Prince, Seinfeld, Buffy the Vampire Slayer, Friends, Frasier, which is a spinoff of Cheers, like all these kind of different shows that are kind of coming in and changing the envelope while at the same time providing something new and going out into different kinds of, Star Trek. We saw the rebirth of Star Trek with the Next Generation show, which brought Star Trek back on. You see all these different kind of genres, and then you get into the 2000s where you have these shows that are not only trying to push the envelope of long form storytelling, but also pushing the envelope of like the presentation of material. Where now we're getting into almost this like we're pushing the envelope on like the typical like friends getting together and having like the different types with How I Met Your Mother, and how that's like a kind of an advancement on Friends. And then you also get the situation like The Office, where that's the first single camera, not relying on the 3-camera laugh track setup, that really I would say is the primary revolutionizer, because in terms of also introducing the mockumentary and making that as mainstream as it is now, and how that's utilized, like kind of TV, you can always go to the individual decades and see, I would say with sitcoms much more so than dramas, because dramas I feel like are a lot more timeless than certain sitcoms, but you can always go to sitcoms and see how they are a reflection of their time. And I feel like in a way how that ends up making them more timeless, where to me, I think when I think back on this decade in terms of the sitcoms that most influenced me, I'm going to think of two overall. In terms of live action ones, not animated ones for this decade, I'm going to think of Community, and I'm going to think of Silicon Valley, because those two were the ones that had the most marked effect on me.
I agree.
But also the most marked effect on terms of pushing the genre in forms of, in terms of like further enveloping, where Community with all the meta humor, while also like taking place around like that's Dan Harmon's whole thing, taking place around a traditional setting and just going into like every different single bizarre wacky scenario. And Silicon Valley, where it takes kind of like something that had really been untapped in the sitcom world, where most sitcoms are around workplace or just like gathering of friends overall, and really seeks to take those and place that in the tech world, and in terms of use that in order to like kind of come to terms with just how that reflects, because technology is a big part of what reflects the changing world. How Silicon Valley kind of embodies that. That to me is what I feel like is going to make this one of the more timeless shows.
Yeah, so I mean, I think I'm sort of at the end of my rope here. I have like a closing thought. I think it's time to go there. Would you agree?
Yeah, I'd agree with that.
So I think I'm glad that you brought Community into it, because what I would say is I do agree with you in regards to like the modern sitcom and shows that really push the envelope. I think that Silicon Valley and Community did that, and for me personally, it's because I grew up watching the ensemble cast, and then as a filmmaker analyzing it and going back and watching the shows I grew up with under a different lens, what have you. I got to see the flaws and the qualities that were good about those shows accented at such a stronger level, because I had a deeper understanding of what it takes to make them and write them and to see them pay off. So for me, yeah, Silicon Valley and Community, and I'm sure we'll find others as we go on, and we'll do our TV of the decade episode. And those shows took the traditional formula and sort of flipped it on its side, and they did something that I think the ensemble cast has been building towards for a long time, and that's a perfect balance. In my opinion, both of these shows struck a perfect balance, especially Silicon Valley. I'm excited to see what comes next, because I think like the reason you have, Barry and a few other shows starting to take off again is because of this progression, this pushing the envelope further and further and further within the sitcom, the comedy genre, is thanks to every time someone takes a risk, and thank God television is taking risks, is because we're getting these amazing long-form stories that almost make the movies laughable. So, in conclusion, yeah, I think Silicon Valley is a very important show, and while the last few seasons didn't hit as strongly to me as the first three, by no means does that take anything away from it. I just think they set a very high bar.
Definitely. And in terms of conclusion, and what I think is going to make Silicon Valley stand the test of time, again, besides of being like, for me, one of the better and kind of more underrated, because in terms of like with people talking about like shows of the decade, like I remember when Watch Mojo originally released their first top 10 shows of the decade, Silicon Valley I don't even think got an honorable mention, which to me was disgraceful. But in terms of kind of what sets this apart from like the other like kind of like wacky sitcoms is that it had a cast that, while yeah, they were types, they also like never stopped being like real characters. And in terms of like accentuating and playing around with the individual actors' personalities, which is something that comedy has always done much more so than drama. I think it's a situation where, yeah, you in terms of like following these characters and their journey, obviously it's got that one overall struggle relatable, where it's like the whole thing is that these guys want to start their own company, but not in the sense that like everyone else does. And it's kind of like, yeah, you're following the trials and tribulations, but it's also a situation of where like they kind of don't know what they're doing for most of it. Like they start off like Pied Piper originally is supposed to be like, I think like a music software download space, and it ends up blossoming into like, there's one point where they're gonna like make like a video streaming software, and then there's a point where they're gonna turn it into like literally the new internet, to the point where it ends, the whole reason why they have to tank it, and again how that finale works as a brilliant juxtaposition to all the others, is this time, rather than it just being an act of God that saves them and allows them to continue to persevere and continue, they literally have to sabotage their own launch of their new internet, because they've created something that's so, they basically created Skynet, where they've created something that's so powerful and so beyond their control and so like not at all what they were originally going for, that they have to crash their original baby, like just in order to kind of preserve the status quo, which is something that, which is a very daring area that not a lot of comedies go for. So much about comedies is kind of going back to the status quo, and how this kind of flipped the lid in terms of, yeah, the characters ended up at the status quo where yeah, you have like kind of the last episode is shot very documentary-esque in terms of like what they're all doing after the whole Pied Piper thing. It really is kind of emotionally something. Like, I got a lot more emotional feels out of this finale than I thought I was going to. Like, I'm like, overall, if you asked me at the beginning of the year what finale I was obviously looking forward to more, which I think is an easy question, but also which finale I was expecting to get more emotion out of, in terms of between picking Silicon Valley and Game of Thrones, if you told myself at the beginning of the year that I was going to have more of an emotional reaction to the Silicon Valley finale than I was to the Game of Thrones finale, I would have told you were kidding yourself. But that's just the year, and that's just the overall what we've gotten. And it's been definitely a very interesting and funny and entertaining these last 6 years in terms of following this show, and I can't wait to see what these guys do next. Mike Judge, I don't know what his next project is. He's probably going to take a step back. Alec Berg has already proven himself on more than one occasion with 2 phenomenal seasons of Barry, which I hope continues to be HBO's new landmark show that kind of takes them into this new decade, or at least the first half of this decade. So,
I love me some Barry Block.
Yeah, that's kind of like my overall end-all, be-all thoughts on this show.
So speaking of end-all, be-all, how do you rate television? What's like the...
It's tricky, because it's like, overall, especially since we're talking about a last season, like it's easy when we're talking about like one season, like Stranger Things or The Boys, you know, especially if it's a debut season, especially in this new era, you know, where the whole thing is that debut seasons so much of the time just feel like a movie in and of itself, encapsulated. So much to the point so, well, how when they end and they have that inevitable cliffhanger, or just something that's supposed to, like, at the very least just put the tension on hold until the next season, it's almost kind of like, feels like almost like a gut punch, where it's like, oh yeah, I've been so engrossed in this that I'm expecting it to have this crazy ending, and then you don't get that, you know, where it's like Stranger Things season 3. What I talked about is that, man, I was really looking forward to this ending, because I was kind of like starting to like really notice the tropes, and it was starting to get really repetitive to the point where it's taken away from my overall enjoyment of that. And then when it kind of like ended still on a cliffhanger, I was like, oh, but wait, there's more. I was just groaning. Or like with The Boys, where it's like I'm so engrossed, and then it ends on that cliffhanger in order to open for season 2. I'm a little bit conflicted, because I'm like, on the one hand, yeah, I'm super pumped to see where this goes, but at the same time, I'm like, man, I was so expecting and being set up for like this revolution that I feel like this new season is going to almost feel like a sequel of sorts, rather than like the next season of television. But for Silicon Valley and how it ended, and like kind of like how it's always been kind of like maintaining that traditionalist, where they always kind of like had that one set ending where it's like, oh, the act of God saves them and allows them to continue to persevere, and finally seeing how they were going to end it, and now seeing how they ended it, kind of like pulling an inverse, it kind of is like really awesome to me. And weirdly enough, this is probably one of my overall favorite series finales. So if I had to rank this individual season amongst the shows, the way that I had it ranked is, first 3 seasons are my favorite, more so than these last 3 seasons. I think I had it ranked as season 3 is my favorite, then season 1, then season 2. Then out of this second batch, it's season 6 is my favorite, then 5, then 4. 4 for me is my least favorite overall. That's how I have the overall show ranked. In terms of this past season, I would probably give this a 4 out of 5. Right,
okay.
If the first 3 seasons are a 4.5, then this is a 4 to me. Where it obviously doesn't have the magic that the first 3 seasons did, but in terms of kind of conquering the hill that it had to climb up after those last 2 seasons, I think it definitely did a very good job of that.
Yeah, I'll give you that. And what I'll say is I want to save where the season 6 lands for our top 10 TV shows of the year, because spoiler alert, it's going to land on that list. So I'm just going to sort of like give the whole show a bow tie and then wrap it up and present it to you guys. And the number that speaks to me in my head is like 7.5, 75. I think I'll give this like a 75 out of 100, like a 3.5 stars as a series, which to me is very high. No show in the history of shows in my scope has gotten a clear 5, because nothing is perfect. So to be in that 3.5, 4-star range means you really struck a chord with me as a viewer, as a watcher, as a consumer. And it's sad to see this one go, but I'm at least glad that Alec Berg is doing good things, and I hope Mike Judge will go on. I'm sure he'll go on to do something great. So
yeah, and definitely, and just to like kind of wrap it up, it's like, how many other shows can you say that you're sad to see them go? Like, I can
Not
tell you
many.
this in terms of like the amount of shows that have ended in the last couple of years. Like, I don't know, maybe it's just because me, like, of how I've kind of been molded in terms of this end-all overall decade that we've been in with movies and TV. But like for me, I like maybe Breaking Bad, but Breaking Bad again, I missed the whole thing of when that show was on. I binge watched the whole show when it was on Netflix. So this is one of the first shows in a long time that I'm legitimately sad to see go. And with that, Chris, plug us away. Do your thing.
You guys know the deal at this point. We appreciate you being here. That's the number one most important thing we want you to know. Thank you for giving us your time, your ears. We enjoy doing this. It's fun doing this. And so the fact that, like, I don't know, there's a surprisingly greater number of downloads than I thought would happen in the short run so far. So thank you. Thank you so much. And you could follow both of us at our personals. I'm at Christian Ivanko.
Like, I'm Christian Ivanko, and that is Dominic Rizzi.
And that is Dominic Rizzi. And you could follow us on the podcast page and our personals. But most importantly, the reason we're together in this room right now is the podcast, and that's at Talkin Podcast. Talkin TV, no G, and anywhere that matters. It's anywhere that matters.
Spotify, that's the primary place. Anchor,
yeah, Spotify, Anchor, Apple. You know the
Apple
deal,
Music.
guys.
You guys know the deal.
And since you guys know the deal, this shouldn't come as any shock to you, but I usually like to hand it over to my main man, Dom, who ends the show in a way that I could not even come close to touching. Dom, what do you have to leave the listeners with today?
I mean, I think they know it at this point, but it's watch more fucking movies, and in this case, TV shows.